And when I hear many of my colleagues on the other side of the House chamber speaking in favor of abandoning the cause, I'm reminded of Ronald Reagan, who attacked Libya with air power and called Gaddafi the mad dog of the Middle East. And I yield back to Remainer.
Has expired. Gentlelady from Florida. You reserve. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 90 seconds to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin,
Michigan's
ranking member of the Ways and
Means. Without objection.
We should learn from the past. There are indeed times when American national interests should overtake political or partisan political interests. I remember the debate on Kosovo 12 years ago. Congress refused to authorize American action by a split vote. That was a tragic mistake. House Republican leadership opposed that resolution. 187 noes against 31 yeses. I believe it was clear then that Republicans would not have opposed the Kosovo resolution, at least in those numbers, if George Bush had been president. Today there are echoes from Kosovo on this Libyan resolution. The Republicans should not make the same mistake again. We should join together to support the Hastings resolution that's consistent with the War Powers Act. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Continue to reserve.
I'm going to yield. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for a minute and a half.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the Hastings resolution. I think it's important to remember that U.S. military force is a very awesome thing and should only be employed in very select circumstances. We misused that power when it came to Iraq, and we used that power in an improper way and too long in Afghanistan. But when people are being slaughtered by dictators around this world, where massive loss of lives and innocents are at stake, I think it is appropriate for the United States to step up and protect those people. Yes, we do have business in Libya. We have business in protecting mass murder from happening and stopping mass murder from happening around the world. We have business in stopping the destabilization of regions like North Africa. We have a business in making sure that the peaceful resolutions in Egypt and in Tunisia are not undermined. We have business in making sure that dictators like Ali Saleh in Yemen and Bashar al-Assad in Syria are not emboldened, and the signal does not go out to them that they can continue to wipe out their population and nobody cares. I believe that if I was in this Congress when Rwanda or Srebrenica or Darfur were happening, I pray that I would stand up and say that those people need to have some protection and that the most powerful nation in the world shouldn't stand by while innocent women and children are being mowed down. And I hope today that colleagues will join in that because it's the right thing to do. Thank you very much.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, how much time is remaining on each side?
The gentleman from California has 10 minutes remaining, and the gentlelady from Florida has 6 minutes remaining.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to... I'm pleased to yield 90 seconds to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
Gentleman from Texas is gentlelady from Texas is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank the distinguished speaker, and to the distinguished members that are on this floor. What a heck of a position to be in. And let me make it very clear, this is a set of circumstances that frames itself around the Constitution, the War Powers Resolution, that indicates that Congress must be consulted. but I am in the middle of my actions that took place some months ago or many weeks ago as the crisis and the murderous acts of Colonel Gaddafi began to siege his people. And we went to the Libyan embassy to ask for Colonel Gaddafi to step down, and we joined with the then ambassador in his courageous acts. Colonel Gaddafi is known to oppress his people, to deny rights of freedom of press and speech, as well as association, to train dictators in oppression and intelligence, and the murderous acts still go on. But it is a crisis when we have an administration, unfortunately, that has not seen fit to undertake the consultation that is necessary. Yet, I believe that we should finish the task, and it is different from Iraq, and it is different from Afghanistan. We have a time certain, and as well, we have the Arab League that has asked us to stand with them against the oppression of one of its members. This is a door opener to say to the people that we have asked to be with us to go against terrorist acts, to stand for democracy. So this is a devastating position to put the members of Congress in, but we must do our duty today. And I believe that it is good to say that the Hastings Amendment gives us this framework,
has expired.
Though I would prefer 6 months, and I hope there is an opportunity to address this for a limited time. I yield back.
From California.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Gentleman from California is recognized for a minute and a half.
Mr. Speaker and members, apparently the House has debated for more than almost 40 years now the War Powers Agreement, or War Powers Law. What we have before us today is a way in which we can effect that law and put it into place, and there's reason for us to support the hasty amendment, or the hasty resolution. And there are 4 reasons. First of all, there's a humanitarian issue here, and that's why we went into this in the first place. The United Nations resolution on the obligation to protect, and indeed there was a threat. Secondly, this particular intervention is supported by the United Nations, by NATO, by the Arab League, in a most unusual situation, asking for support of the European and the United States in an Arab country. Finally, we must continue our support of the effort, and we must do it in a very limited way. The resolution does that. It provides for a very limited scope and a limited period of time, and therefore it is in order, and it appropriately puts the Congress, both houses, if this should pass the Senate, in support of the operation, thereby fulfilling the War Powers Act. I'd ask for an aye vote on the resolution.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman who seeks time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased and honored to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, the Chairman of Foreign Affairs Committee's Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Human Rights.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I thank our distinguished chairwoman for yielding, and thank her for her leadership today and every day on human rights issues. Let me just say, Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.J. Res. 68. You know, when the U.S. intervention in Libya began last March, I raised, and I was among several still unanswered questions about our involvement. They included questions about the identity and the aims of the rebels, the varying presidential statements that seemed to shift like the wind, the level of U.S. involvement, the possibility of Gaddafi retaliating against American interests outside of Libya, and whether U.S. ground troops might well be requested at some point, although the resolution seems to clearly say that that would not be authorized by Congress. In the course of the debate over the constitutionality and viability of the War Powers Resolution, these questions have remained unanswered. The President has refused to seek congressional approval of his action or even to provide a full explanation of his decisions. And the NATO campaign continues. New questions have arisen about U.S. participation in what is now NATO's involvement in Libya. Let me just say, mention was made a moment ago about Kosovo, and that somehow the Republican opposition to Kosovo was political. I remember, because I was very involved in the Balkan situation, I visited there many times, visited with Milosevic, the dictator, in Belgrade. actually was in Vukovar right before it fell in Croatia to the attackers coming out of Serbia. Frankly, the statement that was made earlier, I think, did a disservice to those of us who were not supportive of the Kosovo operation. There was no plan for the Kosovo Albanians. If members will remember, that country was literally pushed out into Macedonia and elsewhere, especially to Macedonia, because there was no plan when Milosevic sent in the ground troops and killed thousands of people because we had no plan to protect them. You know, the revisionism, somehow that was a political calculation, falls very, very far from the truth. I actually held hearings during it and stated my opposition based on principle, as did other members. So I just would hope that there would not be that look back that does a disservice to Republican opposition. Who exactly are we backing in Libya? What is the justification on international law is there for directing both U.S. foreign government assets to a rebel entity that is not democratically elected and therefore not necessarily representative of the people of that country? We don't know. In addition, a senior NATO official told CNN on June 9th that Gaddafi was a legitimate target of the bombing campaign. Even though this was expressed as a NATO position, are we now to understand that the Obama administration is sanctioning the killing of foreign leaders, again pursuant to what international criteria or legal justification? Mr. Speaker, again, I call on my colleagues to vote down this resolution that is offered, H.J. Res. 68, and I yield back to our distinguished young lady,
time has
Counsel
expired. Who seeks time? Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield a minute to the gentleman from New York, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Meeks.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I say that we have an opportunity. The camera of history is rolling. It's watching what we do today. We can authorize the President to continue the limited use of the United States services working in conjunction with NATO today, so that we can show that we're united with our allies. Think about what history will have 50 years from now. We have an individual who was going to massacre his individuals. And by us stepping in, working in conjunction with our NATO allies, we are saving thousands of lives. What would have taken place historically if we had allowed the annihilation of the Libyan people? Let's stick together on this. Let's look at how this how we're together. From its inception, this has been an international initiative to enforce UN Resolution 1973 and to respond to the requests of Libya's Transitional National Council, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the Arab League. President Obama deployed U.S. assets early, said he will continue just with what we have, our special assets, and then have no troops on the ground. It is the camera of history rolling. Let's work together. Let's pass this resolution.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield a minute of time to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we were asked to come into Libya by the Libyans, by the Arab League, by the Gulf Cooperation Council, by the European Union, and by the United Nations Security Council. Today, we are standing with those who believe in freedom, in human rights, and in the rule of law. But also today, as we debate this issue, Muammar Gaddafi's forces continue their merciless assault against civilians and combatants alike, not just in Misrata, but in the western mountains and cities throughout central Libya. The Libyan Transitional National Council, which needs our support, is grossly short of weaponry, money, training, but they are the boots on the ground, fighting and dying to dislodge Gaddafi, who's a bad guy. We need to be on the other side, not giving a comfort to Gaddafi so that he can thank us for the resolution of this vote. We need to make clear we don't support him. We do support people who are fighting for the same values that define our country. 38 of those people were killed just this week. To cut off funding for the NATO operation is to side with Gaddafi against the forces who are fighting for those values which define us. And, you know, the idea that we haven't been this hasn't been explained sufficiently by the President. We have minds of our own. We know the facts. We can make a judgment. The right judgment is to side with the President and to continue this until America shows that it's true to its own values and principles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from California.
Speaker, could you provide us with the amount of time remaining on each side?
California has 5 minutes remaining. The gentlelady from Florida has 3 minutes remaining.
5. So, please to yield a minute for the gentleman from Vermont,
Gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. There are 2 issues before Congress. One is a reassertion of its responsibility under Article 1 in the War Powers Act. Number 2 is a decision on the limited use of force for humanitarian mission in Libya. The Hastings resolution accomplishes both. It reasserts our authority under Article 1 and the War Powers Act. Number 2, it says, yes, we do support limited intervention with a role for the U.S. in saving lives in Libya. That mission is necessary to avert a humanitarian disaster. 2, the mission has broad international support, including from the Arab League. 3, the U.S. role is limited in scope. No boots on the ground. And finally, we are, by acting, asserting our responsibility under the War Powers Act and our responsibility under Article 1. I yield back.
Who seeks time? Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentlelady from Florida.
Sir, I reserve the right to close, Mr. Speaker, so I will hold until they're done, and then I will yield our time.
She reserves her time. Gentleman from California.
Is the gentlelady saying she has no other speakers? Or?
Just our closing speaker, Mr.
All right.
Mr. Berman.
Then we have that problem we have the problem of the members who want to speak who are not yet on the floor.
So sorry, but not my problem.
And on whose time is this dialogue?
The gentleman from California seek time.
I think in this case, I will yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
All right, I'll interrupt and you can come.
California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we're 90 days into this operation, and the majority is bringing up this resolution in order to embarrass the White House. Let's just call it for what it is. They know it will fail. They want to continue to play games with U.S. national security. Let's be honest about what's happening here. The Republican leadership allowed this resolution to come to the floor for one reason and one reason only. They know it will fail, and they think its defeat will be a political defeat for the White House. If that type of trifling and toying with national security appeals to them, so be it. Mr. Speaker, I think our commitments to NATO and the humanity, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserve. The gentleman's.
You need to reserve, but we do have the power.
Reserves her time. Does the gentleman from California
the right to close?
But
there is additional time, if I could tell my good friend.
Pardon me?
If the gentleman
yes.
would yield. There is additional time on this resolution immediately following ours with armed services. So if there are any folks who come in later, perhaps they could speak it during that time.
In that case,
gentleman from California.
All right. So I yield myself the remainder of our...
Gentleman has 3 minutes remaining.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I think our commitments to NATO and the humanitarian crisis that created the NATO operation in Libya are too important to be exploited for cynical political purposes. In my view, the perfect authorization would have been a 6-month authorization for a limited purpose, with a limitation on that authorization with respect to a position the House has stood for the entire time, as has the President, and that is no boots on the ground. But the Republicans didn't give this side the choice of the resolution for authorization. They told us what the resolution for authorization would be, and that's a very unfortunate kind of a situation. So we will go through this process, and perhaps at the end of the day, after this resolution fails, we will get another letter to the House of Representatives sent to the Speaker thanking us from Colonel Gaddafi for once again demonstrating that we want to send a message that he is going to prevail in this conflict. And when that happens, what do we think the dictator of Syria is going to think? Faced with a choice of change or quitting, he will hear the message. The way to survive, the way to hold on for power, is for a despot to continue to kill his own people without the rest of the world doing anything. There are critical alliances at stake. There are critical interests at stake. The national security question is far beyond simply what is going to happen in Libya, but in its neighbors, Egypt and Tunisia, throughout the Middle East and through the entire world. The message of trying to say that we're going to pull the plug on this particular operation, and heavens knows we could spend time talking about the way the administration has handled it, but right now we have one choice: to pull the plug on this baby or to let it play out in a limited and responsible fashion to achieve our goals and send a message that the civilized world is not going to stand for this kind of barbarity and brutality. I urge and I vote on the resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
It's back his time. The gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. To wrap up on our side, I'm proud and pleased to yield the remaining time, 3 minutes, to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Griffin, a member of both the Committees on Foreign Affairs and Armed Services.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition to House Joint Resolution 68, which authorizes the President to continue military operations in Libya. I appreciate all the policy arguments that I've heard here today, but the question for me is it illegal or not? And if it's a question of law, then all of the arguments about making this group mad or not being a good ally, etc., those are very persuasive, but those are not legal arguments. Those don't change whether the actions in Libya are constitutional or legal. Those are policy arguments. The President continues to be in violation of the War Powers Resolution, which requires congressional approval for military action within 60 days of the initial use of our armed forces. That deadline expired long ago. The President continues to involve the U.S. military in this illegal conflict and has continually ignored requests to gain congressional approval. What's so hard, Mr. President, about coming to the House and consulting with the Congress? What's so hard about that? Other presidents who may have their doubts about the constitutionality of the War Powers Resolution have still gone through the process to respect the people that are represented by this body. Reportedly, the President ignored advice from his top lawyers at the Pentagon and the Justice Department, who said that he no longer had the legal authority to continue military action without congressional authorization. Furthermore, this is not a legal argument, but I think it's relevant, we're broke. The price tag of the military action in Libya has already cost the U.S. government over $750 million. This resolution would authorize the President to continue military action in Libya for up to a year. That could result in billions of dollars of funding by the American taxpayer that we just can't afford. We cannot spend precious taxpayer funds to support this military action while the President flouts the law and Constitution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields back his time. The Chair will remind the members to direct their comments to the Chair. Gentlelady from
I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentlelady yields back her time. All time is expired. Relations. From gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the bill and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill and yield myself such time as I may consume. The President's initial justification for our military intervention in Libya was that it was necessary to prevent the massacre of Libyan civilians by government forces in Benghazi, and that this would be strictly a humanitarian mission. As I noted back in March, deploying American warriors to protect civilians from a brutal dictator is a noble cause. Yet I also expressed my reservations at the time because I feared that the mission could result in a protracted stalemate. Although the President promised the American people that our involvement would be limited, a matter of weeks, not months, we find ourselves past the 3-month mark with no end in sight. This bill would authorize operations for up to a year. We're currently engaged in a war that is vital to our national security. In Afghanistan, we're fighting extremists who sheltered the terrorist organization that killed 3,000 Americans on September 11th and would again provide them with a sanctuary if given the chance. We're in the process of consolidating our victory in Iraq and still have 50,000 troops there in harm's way. Indeed, a clear strategic vision is required to make any military intervention successful. Since this operation began, the connection between strategic ends and operational means has been lacking. Consequently, unless the NATO mission departs from its original mandate, it appears that our only recourse is to hope that Gaddafi will voluntarily leave his country. I cannot support a long-term commitment of U.S. forces to hostilities when success is based on hope. Furthermore, the President failed to seek congressional authorization for this operation on the flimsiest of legal rationale. It's not appropriate for this body to cover his lapse with a blanket authorization. I therefore urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself 3 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. I rise in support of this resolution. This is Congress exercising its authority as is appropriate. And I agree with the people who say that Congress should do this. And I just wish we would understand that Congress has a certain responsibility in that regard. Yes, the President should have asked us, but it's been over 3 months, and this House has chosen not to act until now. I think it's appropriate that we are. I think we should authorize this mission in Libya, and I strongly support that mission. Now, like most Americans, when this issue first came up, when the people in Libya started rising up against their oppressive dictator, I was very reluctant about the idea of U.S. military involvement, as I think we always should be. I think in the past we have been too over-anxious to use the U.S. military in places where it was not a good fit. We need to think carefully about this. And in every instance, we need to strike a balance. On the one hand, what is the positive impact that our involvement could have? And on the other hand, what are the risks of that involvement? And I think there was a unique set of circumstances in Libya that made this make sense. First of all, our involvement could have a very positive impact. We had international support. The UN, NATO, the Arab League. Everybody in the world wanted Gaddafi to be stopped from slaughtering the civilians who were rightfully standing up and asking for the basic rights that we take for granted in this country. And in addition to that, our military budget is roughly equivalent to the entire rest of the world's combined. That gives us a unique set of capabilities. That unique set of capabilities was critical to stopping Gaddafi from crushing, again, the legitimate democratic aspirations of the Libyan people. If we had not acted, they would be crushed, many more civilians would be dead, and Gaddafi would be back in power. We cannot walk away from that responsibility and say that, well, yes, we don't like Gaddafi, we wish the people there would do well, but we simply don't want to support the action that's necessary to give them that opportunity. So in this case, I think the mission did make sense for that reason. The United States was in a position to make a difference and stand up for people who were asking for legitimate rights. But then the broader question is, well, what does that have to do with the United States? That may be true, but it's true in a lot of countries. The reason this is so important is because of the broader movement that is going on, the so-called Arab Spring. People in Muslim countries rising up and demanding representative rights. That has an incredible impact on us. The greatest threat that we face as a country right now is from al-Qaeda and their ideology. That ideology arose in part because of a whole bunch of repressive governments across the Muslim world that weren't providing for their people. A number of repressive governments, by the way, which the United States has in the past supported. We had an opportunity to do the opposite, to stand up for Muslim people. And let me tell you, in the history of this country, I don't think we've ever gotten as much positive press in the Muslim TV stations and Muslim media as we got for standing up to Gaddafi. This has been enormously helpful to us in that broader ideological effort. We had national security interests here for standing up. Now as a House, I don't want us to stand up and say that we're going to back down from that commitment that we made. And make no mistake about it, if we defeat this resolution and pass the Rooney resolution, we will stop the mission in Libya and empower Muammar Gaddafi, something that I know nobody wants to do.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Burton.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. You know, I've heard a number of people say, well, the Constitution does give the President latitude, but during the Nixon administration, Congress passed the War Powers Act, and then when the President vetoed it, Congress overrode his veto, and so the War Powers Act became law. Now, whether or not you believe it's constitutional, it has never been tested in the courts. And so it's the law. And the law says, as well as the Constitution, at least this is what most of the people who've looked at the Constitution believe is what it stands for, the Constitution and the War Powers Act says the President cannot do what he did without the support and approval of Congress. Now, he's gotten us into the war in Libya, and it is, in effect, our war. People say, well, no, it's NATO. Well, we are providing over 8,000 of the military personnel on the ships and in the air. The majority of the flights that are taking place where they're doing the bombing are done by our airmen and our aircraft. Over 90% of the missiles that are being used at over $1 million per copy are American missiles. And this is going to cost billions of dollars. If this were to pass and we were to stay there for over a year, you could count on it costing $2 or $3 billion. Now, my colleague from Arkansas just a few moments ago talked about us being broke. The American people know, if Congress doesn't, that we're $1.4, $1.5 trillion short this year. And we're $14 trillion in debt. We're printing money that our kids are going to have to deal with because they're going to have to pay for the debt down the road. Some of us will pay if we live long enough, but our kids are certainly going to inherit the debt. And so we're adding to the debt by going into a war we shouldn't be in, and without the approval of the Congress in accordance with the War Powers Act of the Constitution. Now, my big concern is, and I'm going to talk on the other bill that's coming up later on, my big concern is not just Libya. My big concern is this president, unless we send a very strong message to him, may take us into Syria. There's humanitarian problems in Syria right now, and the reason they went into Libya, they said, was because of the humanitarian problems. He talked to the French, the English, the NATO, the United Nations, and the Arab League for about 2 weeks before we went into Libya, but he didn't have time to talk to the Congress, who appropriates the money and authorizes this stuff. He's the commander-in-chief once we go to war, but he needs the authority from Congress to go into it, and he didn't do it. So there are a lot of wars of opportunity. The president could go into Syria. He could go to the Ivory Coast. There's a lot. May I have one more minute?
I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
There are a lot of places we could go to war if we choose to do it. There's humanitarian problems around the world. But unless it's a threat to the United States or an attack on the United States, the president does not have the authority to do what he did without the support and approval of Congress. President Bush came to Congress before he went into Iraq. President Bush came to Congress before he went into Afghanistan. And that's as it should be. And this president should not overstep his boundaries. And what I wish we would do, which would exceed the legislation we're going to be talking about today, is to pass legislation to cut off all funds for Libya. I know it would not pass the Senate, but it sure would send a signal to the President and the White House that we're not going to allow him to go into war without the approval of the American people and the approval of Congress. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished minority whip, gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The previous speaker deludes himself, and he's my friend, if he thinks the message we send today goes only to the President. The message will go to all the world. The message will go to Muammar Gaddafi. The message will go to our NATO allies. The message will go to every nation of the world that America does not keep faith with its allies. America must lead. We must not equivocate. Such a course would encourage the enemies of peace, the bullies of the world. People around the world look to our country's strength in their struggle for democracy and basic human rights. As it happens, I said that in 1999 when Clinton sent troops to stop the genocide in Bosnia. And he did so. And the authorization lost on this floor shamefully, 213 to 213. One of the darkest days I have served in this institution. Let us not repeat that mistake. Let us not repeat that message to our NATO allies, to our European allies, to all the world, that America cannot be counted on. At the same time, Congress was voting to undermine their mission as they flew to Kosovo. In recent months, people across the Middle East have bravely stood to demand that their government respect their fundamental rights. I've stood with the gentleman from Indiana on behalf of human rights around the world. The Libyan people, who have been subject to the dictatorship of Muammar Gaddafi, who has more blood on his hands, of Americans' blood on his hands, than any other person other than Osama bin Laden in the last 3 decades. We're among those who insisted that enough was enough. Gaddafi responded by unleashing widespread violence and threatening countless lies, publicly promising to go door to door and kill those who stood against him. In response to this threat of Gaddafi's against those civilian people, the European Union, the Arab League, the United Nations Security Council, and a unanimous NATO called for action to protect Libyan civilians. The United States is participating in this action both in order to prevent brutal attacks against civilians and in order to stand by our allies. President Obama has made clear from the beginning that our allies needed to take the leading role in Libya. We can't do it all, but that does not mean we can't support those who choose and take the responsibility of leading. NATO has done that, and to this point, the campaign against Gaddafi has proven successful. His exports of oil have ceased. He is running short on funds. Cabinet and military officials continue to defect from his regime. China has just hosted the Libyan opposition in China, and the opposition controls eastern Libya and is making progress in the west. I believe that the wrong decision today will significantly compromise that progress. Gaddafi wrote us a letter in the last debate just some weeks ago and thanked the House of Representatives for its debate. Is that the message we want to send to Gaddafi? I think not. It would put civilian lives at risk to withdraw. It would potentially stall the growing movements for democratization, not just in Libya, but across the Middle East, and indeed across the world. And it would severely undermine our NATO alliance, as we all know. If we want our allies to stand by us in our time of need in Afghanistan, we have to stand by them in places like Libya. We're either in an alliance or we're not. I do believe that President Obama could and should have done a better job of consulting with Congress at the outset of hostilities. And I do believe we are involved in hostilities. But I believe that we must, as a faithful ally and defender of freedom, defeat the Rooney resolution and support the Hastings resolution. America ought to do no less, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes. My friend and colleague, a member of the Committee on Armed Services, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. West.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I rise in opposition to this amendment. Very simply, the War Powers Act of 1973 states, the President can send U.S. armed forces into action abroad only by authorization of Congress or in case of a national emergency created by an attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. So as we look at the mission or the perceived mission that we have in Libya, it does not even meet this criteria. I stand here today as someone who has been sent forth from these shores in the 22 years that I served in the United States Army. I stand here as the son of a man who left these shores to go defend this great country in World War II. I stand here as the younger brother of a man who left these shores to go defend this country and fight in Vietnam. And I stand here today as the nephew of a young man, a captain, who has already done 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan. Many of my friends have called me. Some call me as Colonel, some call me as Alan. And they say, we need you to do one simple thing. Understand that the oath that they take is to support and defend the Constitution, to support and defend the laws of this country. They need us to stand up and be the guardians of the laws of this country. Just before I came here today, I promoted Jerry Lee Stern to being a major. And I read him that oath of office, that he would greatly take what we must do now as this body, as legislators of this great nation, is uphold the laws and not send our men and women into an undefined and unspecified mission. They want to fight. They want to stand up for us. Let's do the right thing by them, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I appreciate the time. I'm going to vote for the Hastings resolution and against the Rooney resolutions for one person in particular. 3 words, Jane Ann Morgan, a high school friend of mine in Pasadena, California, who was on Pan Am Flight 103. She and 177 other Americans lost their lives 23 years ago, and we should not forget them. Gaddafi was Osama bin Laden before there was Osama bin Laden. And we cannot stop until he is out of power and the 178 Americans who died and the soldiers who were injured in the Berlin disco's lives are remembered. I will support the resolution and vote with thinking of Jane Ann Morgan today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Just for the record, Mr. Speaker, the original mission was not to get Gaddafi. The original mission, as explained by the President, was to help for humanitarian purposes those civilians that Gaddafi was threatening. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
I want to thank the gentleman and also associate myself with his remarks just now. We were told this was about protecting civilians. It's become a cover for regime change, and just because we can change a regime with military power doesn't mean we should do it. And using military action doesn't mean that you're going to achieve the objectives that maybe you haven't even clearly defined. Furthermore, if our allies make a mistake, do we follow them? If our allies are going out of the war, why should we go in? Right now, you have China's foreign minister saying, we hope the two parties in the conflict can attach importance to the country and the people's interests and earnestly consider the international community's relevant resolution plans, quickly cease hostilities, and resolve the Libyan crisis through political channels. Emir Moussa, the outgoing head of the Arab League, said this 2 days ago. Now is the time to do whatever you can to reach a political solution. That has to start with a genuine ceasefire under international supervision. The President of South Africa said a few days ago that this is about regime change, political assassination, and foreign military occupation. Vote against this resolution.
Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I have said that I would vote for a resolution granting authority to the President if it was appropriately limited and conditioned. I'd like to see conditions that require the Benghazi government to remove from their midst the al-Qaeda fighters and the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. I would like to see the condition that we use the Gaddafi money that we seized, some $33 billion, rather than taxpayer money. But put those conditions aside. The one thing we almost all agree on is that we would want to limit this to air forces and perhaps a ground rescue mission if necessary. That's not what this resolution does. Section 1 grants authority to the President to do whatever he decides to do, including armored divisions on the ground, in support of the NATO mission. Don't be fooled by Section 2, which provides the President with non-binding, unsolicited advice that we think that we should limit our ground operations to rescue missions and diplomatic security. This is a grant of authority to the President to put armored divisions on the ground if that's what he chooses to do. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Reserve the balance for time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Speaker. I will yield my final minute in a moment. Consistent with the policy in here, it says Congress does not support deploying, establishing, or maintaining the presence of unions members of the United States Armed Forces on the ground in Libya. The resolution clearly prohibits ground forces. And with that, I yield my final minute to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King.
The gentleman from Iowa is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I would start out first. I'd associate myself with the remarks of the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, who I think laid this out clearly. This is a message that goes globally. This is a destiny message. The Speaker of this House understands his role. He understands that all of America is watching us today, and even though if I'd had a vote, I would have said, no, don't go into Libya. If I had an opportunity to amend this resolution, I would say let's extend the authorization, or let's limit the authorization to a shorter period of time so that the President can come do what he should do. But I believe that there are scores of Americans in their graves today because this Congress sent the wrong message in several conflicts that encouraged our enemy. Clausewitz wrote, "The object of war is to destroy the enemy's will and ability to conduct war." And I would shorten that up to say if you can destroy their will, it doesn't matter what their ability is, you've taken their ability with it. But this message, it encourages our enemy. This resolution says that Congress stands with the constitutional authority of the President to be Commander-in-Chief and to conduct our foreign policy. We should conduct our disagreement with the President domestically, not in our foreign policy, and not by limiting an activity that could abrogate our NATO treaty. I appreciate the gentleman yielding, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California.
Might I ask how much time is left on each side?
The gentleman has 1 minute remaining, and the time of the gentleman from Washington has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I again urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. All time for debate has expired pursuant to House Rule Resolution 238. The previous question is ordered. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Joint resolution authorizing the limited use of the United States Armed Forces in support of the NATO mission in Libya.
The question is on passage of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Request a recorded vote.
Gentleman requests a recorded vote. Those in favor of a recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
And this is the final vote on the first of two Libya resolutions, two Libya measures that the House will consider today. They have wrapped up debate on H.J. Res. 68. This would authorize the President limited use of U.S. military forces in Libya. This is a 15-minute vote. And when they finish up this, they will move on to debate the next measure, which is a bill, H.R. 2268, which would cut off most of the current Defense Department funds for Libya operations. That debate is still ahead as the House votes now on the first of the two measures.
The House today debating military operations in Libya. Two measures. One, getting a vote right now, is a resolution that would give the President limited authority to continue the NATO mission, the U.S. part of the NATO mission in Libya, but would not authorize ground troops. The next measure, a bill to cut off funds for military attacks. It would cut off current Defense Department spending for most operations in Libya except for things like aerial refueling, search and rescue, intelligence, and things like that. They have yet to debate that measure. That's coming up after this vote. And writing about that measure, David Hawkins says in Congressional Quarterly this morning that, quote, a majority of Republicans, the isolationists and whatever Obama does is wrong types, and a near majority of Democrats, the anti-war and the pro-war powers resolution types, are going to band together this afternoon to pass legislation that would conscribe the mission in Libya. It's a dead letter in the Senate, he writes, which will never even take up the measure, but it's nonetheless going to be a historically important symbolic gesture, the first time either chamber has voted against the President's prosecution of an ongoing military campaign since the House, albeit on a tie vote, declined to back Bill Clinton's involvement in Kosovo 12 years ago. And the Associated Press calling the debate today a constitutional showdown between the Commander-in-Chief and Congress. Again, final vote on the resolution that would authorize limited operations in Libya, and debate next on the bill that would cut off funding.
123, the nays are 295. The joint resolution is not passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to have my name removed.